Joining us now on Practical 365 is Sean and Jason. Hi, both, and welcome to the show.
Hey, Steve. How are you?
I'm not bad. So, Sean, before we begin, do you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself? I know you from some fantastic scripts on Practical 365, obviously, but what do you do in your day job?
Yeah, so been working with Practical 365 for about 2 years now. Just after I got awarded MVP, so I'm second year running now, luckily. And in my day job, I'm a modern workplace practice lead in a company called Ergo here in Dublin.
Oh, yes. So that's quite a big partner over in Ireland doing Microsoft 365 deployments and stuff like that then. So
Yeah.
very busy. And Jason, from Quest, do you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself for those that don't know you?
Sure. I'm a product manager on the Quest team. I work with some of the email archive migration solutions, and as well as that, some of the Office 365 management solutions as well.
So what we wanted to talk about is this thing where not just people getting left behind, but stuff gets left behind when companies merge or when you do a migration. And sometimes you worry that, well, what didn't you bring with you? And you don't know what you don't know. And sometimes you do know what it is, and you don't really know where to start. But I was going to start myself by asking Sean a little bit more about what happens on the desktop side of stuff, because I've worked on a lot of these different migrations and they take different forms. What are you seeing happen when people do migrations, whether that's tenant to tenant or transformations to the cloud?
Yeah, so with the evolution over the past few years, it's actually a lot easier for tenant migrations. You've got things like Autopilot, which can Azure AD join your machines and set them up. Now, what people tend to miss in that is the files users have on the desktop, what access they have, what shares they have access to. All of that stuff needs to be taken into account because we're no longer moving in two separate steps. We're not moving mailboxes and workloads followed by the laptop, where we got to move them because they're intrinsically tied to the identity.
So I had a customer call just before this, and they said we're going to roll out and maybe rebuild laptops, move them to become Azure AD joined, Intune managed. So for them, this is something that might be a problem for them. What are the sort of things that you would look out for if this was a project you were working on?
Yeah, so the problem is always what you don't know, because if you know about it, you can make a decision about it. But things that sit on laptops like PST files, like OneDrive, we've begun using in Ergo the preview of the OneDrive Sync Help dashboard, which has been a massive help to this type of scenario, because before you rely on users to flag issues to you if something's not syncing.
Yeah.
So bit by bit, we get visibility into that kind of stuff.
And Jason, do you have any methods or tools where you can assist with trying to find out what you don't know? Because knowing that OneDrive is syncing and it's doing the known folder move stuff is only one part of the puzzle, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Trying to identify some of these problems. I mean, the question is not just what you left behind. Some of the stuff is sometimes intentionally left behind, but how important it is to you and how irreplaceable it is. So, especially with data sets that may contain PII or proprietary organizational information, these are things that are really important. Our PST migration solution, PST Flight Deck, is great at identifying it. In fact, most projects I've been intimately familiar with, we have customers who come to us with an amount of data they say they found, and we'll end up finding double the data that they found in their environment. And PSTs contain all of that.
And that's that is one of those areas where PSTs, people often say, well, I don't have to pay for a tool because they don't know the scale of the problem. And you could almost ask, well, does the data matter? What do people usually say when you ask that question?
Well, I think we've got plenty of use cases where it has mattered, and these end up being compelling events where organizations then end up jumping to attempt to resolve the problem after either somebody in their industry has had a major impact or a major high-profile impact has occurred. The fact is email data has been a critical piece of data for organizations that contains all sorts of sensitive information that is important to that organization, and in many situations they're legally responsible for. So when put under the microscope of how important PST data specifically is for an organization, it tends to be pretty important. But I do agree that administrators don't really like to jump on board on solving it if it's not a very visible problem, because it's a very complicated problem to solve.
Yeah, so if it's a tenant migration, that means that they didn't solve the problem the first time. And now it could matter a lot more, especially if a company's being sold and you've got to carve up that data. Perhaps those PST files don't contain all that companies that's splitting off data, for example. And on the data side of Microsoft 365, there might be shared mailboxes that couldn't move. They may have been exported to PSTs locally. Where would you even begin? It sounds like quite a complex problem to solve that people didn't really have in the past.
It is, and especially in the mergers and acquisitions field, you don't always know what you're getting in a merger situation. You inherit whatever problems that resided within that organization.
Yeah.
And PST files are frequently one of them because it's such a challenging issue to identify. Our solution does go out, and depending on we take into consideration all sorts of storage. We look at the file servers that may or may not reside within the organizations, and then we also basically can look wherever a user has access to look for PST files, consolidate them, identify duplication, and then go through processing, because with that data set specifically, there's a lot of challenges, not just in identification and centralization and recognition of ownership of those files, but in addition to that, the integrity of those files, password protection of those files, and how you go about managing that. All these things are areas that tend to require specialization to be able to address, and why a tooling is often necessary when an enterprise scale level effort for this is taking hold.
So thinking a bit more about other things that get left behind, Sean, I wanted to ask you, tenant migrations in general, there's a lot that you must start off knowing. If you look at the Quest on Demand, for example, you can see a list of what will be left behind that's not migrated by at all, or rather what will be migrated. The list of what gets left behind is almost an ever-growing one in a way, as Microsoft builds services for the cloud first. What are the things you look for first, with or without your discovery scripts that you've written?
Yeah, so obviously I run the discovery scripts from practical365.com to get some of the big hitters and get a high-level view of it.
You wrote them, so
I
should give you credit for that.
Yeah. So if there's any bugs, you can come to me. But realistically, when you talk about what's being left behind, I think the big issue a lot of organizations face is that Azure AD is the identity provider for X number of solutions, right? And those solutions, in a lot of organizations I talk to, they're not necessarily always managed by IT or always visible. It provides identity to it, and then you migrate everybody over. Got 1,000 users set up in your new tenant, and you're really happy with how the weekend went. Everybody's moved, and then they can't sign into their HR system, or they can't sign into some line of business app that they need. And no matter how technically successful your project is, it's a failure if the users can't get their work done on Monday morning. So the approach I take is kind of twofold. One is purely technical discovery, find out what we know, and quantify that, but also talk to the business, try and find out what you use when you sit down at your desk on Monday morning. What do you access to get your job done? You really need to understand how the business works to succeed with a migration like this.
So I know when I've looked at some of the pre-discovery data, when we're looking at a tenant migration project, one thing I've seen, and although we say on Practical 365, and a lot of folks have been saying for some time, you don't want users to self-register as your AD apps. Find an app on the the net and then just sign up for it and then use their identity to do that. Then you get an export list where you might have enterprise apps, which are managed by IT, and then a load of other applications that people have either used once and maybe they signed up for a trial, or they could be a key business app, a finance system, or something like that. And that, I guess you're right. You need to speak to the person who is effectively the application owner, and they might find that quite frustrating. Yes, I signed into WebEx once 6 months ago. I'm never going to do that again. But there can be all sorts in there where you see Monday.com and all these sort of other applications that they could have had a trial for. Do you see that a lot? Because I've seen that as a growing problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the best ways around it is to tidy up from now. Like if you didn't start when you first adopted Office 365 or Azure AD, start today, right? And put in the approvals process for OAuth apps. Yeah. Even if you don't want to put in the approval process, ask somebody to log a ticket if they want to authorize an app. Outside of the risks, it moves away from the governance that you need in your tenant, or else it will just explode and become a mess.
Yes. And as well as bringing PSTs in, as well as identity providers, or Azure AD is the identity provider for an unknown number of applications. Is there anything else that you see isn't commonly being touched on a migration or investigated that should be?
Yeah. So there's a big focus on where the data lives, the core workloads, your SharePoint, OneDrive, Exchange. A lot of people don't generally check for things like how many people rely on forms, how many people send forms out to customers to collect data. Where does that form go once we move? One of the cool features that I've seen in the Quest On Demand tool recently was the meeting request rewrite, which was a big problem for a long time, because you move to a new tenant, everybody's happy until they can't join their own meetings. So it's that kind of stuff that's not core. If we're talking Microsoft, it's not core Office 365, not your SharePoint, for example, but it is a application that the users use.
Yeah. I'm expecting Dataverse and the Power Platform to almost become the new PSTs. So, Jason, do Quest have anything focusing on getting at that programmatically accessible data that's sort of growing as we build applications in the Power Platform and store data in the Dataverse, without giving any secrets away?
We're working on some stuff relating to Power BI to start in our foray of the investigating how to migrate best the Power Automate stuff. It's definitely on our radar for an area of exploration, an area that we find interesting, and it's an area where a lot of people's efforts have customized their work into it and end up having to rebuild it manually a lot of times.
And Sean, how do you deal with that today then? What's your top tip for Power Platform migrations as part of a tenant migration?
Yeah, so the way we tend to approach it is break it into two. One is line of business applications that have been built by IT and dashboards, and then your kind of shadow IT type applications that users have built that, while they are valuable, right, they can be really valuable to the business unit, but not necessarily managed by IT. The business applications are usually documented, they can be brought across. The line of business applications that users have built over time, never documented, I would say.
Yeah.
And whoever built them has left a long time ago. And then you're in a tough spot because you've got to just go into the new environment and try and replicate the functionality that was there before.
Yeah, and that can happen on all sorts of migrations, Google migrations as well, with similar app scripts. But in particular, that's a growing problem. It's great if the application owner's there. You can give them a guide on how to export it and import it. But breaking it up into IT managed and user managed, citizen developers, as they say, is a good strategy, because you can see what's at least known and documented first. And when you're looking to work out how long these things take, and there's a big deadline to hit, you can get the big hitters up there first, can't you?
Yeah, and that's kind of the same Excel macro problem that's been hanging around for a long time. Who wrote this macro, and do we know what it actually does other than gives us results? Well, I think the planning in any tenant-to-tenant migration is, I would say, it's 80 to 90% of the work. And then the other 9% is communication to users, and 1% is actual technical effort, especially if you're using Quest tools.
You're a big fan of Quest tools then. That's good to hear. So you're giving a stamp of approval to those, it seems. And on that stamp of approval to Quest webinars, you are the independent MVP expert. Chatting with Jason on September the 8th, is that right? To go into a lot more detail than we've done today. And you can find that webinar on practical365.com/webinars, where you'll find you've migrated, but what have you left behind? Thank you very much both for joining us on the show today.
Hey, Steve, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Steve.